this is really meant to be a way for us to understand more about the way we make strategic decisions and decision-making in general. And so, this really stems from the concept of wargaming, which Herman Kahn wrote this paper back in 1957, which talks a lot about the way that he would do kind of scenario-based wargaming. So there wasn't as much around randomness or dice or boards at that point, but it was more of a thought experiment about kind of thinking about the branching things that happen into the future when it comes to the way that like our strategies may work out or may not work out. And so I think it's like a very interesting paper, actually, if people want to read it. It's still available on the RAND Corporation website as a PDF. But this has then led to a bunch of other types of wargaming that I think in the United States, there's lots of different military institutions that use it, and then lots of groups like, I think Shell is one of the most well-known wargamers when it comes to strategic planning and foresight. And so wargaming has been around way before this, right? Like I think probably during the Prussian War, I forget the exact name of the game, but that was probably the first time that wargaming really was tried out when it came to some of the randomness elements. So what we're going to try to do is actually join some of this idea of thought, kind of scenario play and randomness, and then we're going to talk a bit about Wardley mapping and the way that that becomes the map for this war game. And it really is meant to answer this question, like, how can we understand the shape of the future? Because in that paper that Kahn wrote, it's not about predicting, right? But it's about understanding that based on the way that we think things may work out, and even things that may be more uncertain, actually, how do we start to understand, like, what are the contours of possibility in the future so that we can maybe build plans that are more resilient, robust, and ideally thrive in a very uncertain future? And so first, I want to give people like a very quick explanation of Wardley mapping. How many people have done Wardley mapping, maybe with like a thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay, cool. I'm trying to see here. Okay, so a good number of people that are familiar. I think like when it comes to Wardley mapping, I think this quote is most interesting from Simon, but like, throughout our history has always been standardization of components that has enabled creations of greater complexity. And this gets to the point of Wardley mapping is really about doing something like a value chain analysis and then looking at the stages of evolution for technology and then the movement of those things around that map. And so what I'll do is maybe just like jump in to show people, what a sample Wardley map would look like. So this is an example. This is a classic one that Simon always uses about making a cup of tea because he's British. And so the customer is at the very top. The kind of job to be done, or the thing that's the use case that we want to talk about. And there's a lot of nuance that we can start to understand about this is to really make a cup of tea. And then inside of this, you can see that there's a cup over here is necessary. There's hot water, which has to come from regular water. There's some spectrum of kind of like tea bags or tea that we can end up using. There's a kettle and there's power. And what this is really meant to do is that when we think about this, is that the higher up in the map it is, the closer it is to the customer. The lower in the map it is, the further away and maybe more abstracted or kind of hidden away from the customer it is. And then from the left to the right, it's really about this idea of what is something that's brand new that hasn't been really tested a lot in the case of, say, Genesis, right? Or could be very custom. There's a bunch of different ways that we can think about that, all the way to commodification, which is, this is something that is so standardized that people don't pay a lot of money for it because it is commodified. And so you can see here that maybe cups are pretty commodified, hot water and power are all pretty commodified in this map. But maybe we're thinking that the kettles that we end up creating are more custom built. And so that would be the way we would actually draw this map for our organization. And that's another important aspect of this, is that this is meant to be a map that you draw for your context and organization. And there's no such thing as a standard map, right? You end up drawing a map based on a group of people getting together and building an understanding and alignment around that. And so that's I think, very important when it comes to this type of Wardley map. So and maybe the last thing about the T part of this is that this is meant to show that there's many different options that are servicing the same kind of component inside of this map, but they have very different ways of going about it. So a regular tea bag is highly commoditized. I can go down the corners, any corner store and buy one and buy them for fairly cheap, right? There's these pyramid tea bags, which are more custom made, nicer looking. They maybe have like higher end teas, but they're a product, definitely, but they're not something that are maybe more standard. And then finally, this idea of like really fresh or loose leaf tea ends up being very custom. I have to put it together myself. It's maybe using higher end tea. And so it's meant to talk about this like spectrum of things. And so I think when we start mapping this value chain, and this is going to be something that I'm going to ask everybody to do in about 5 minutes or so, I'll send you a Miro board and everybody will have their own map that they can start to create around a particular scenario that we're going to talk about. But you end up mapping usually at first from customer all the way to the furthest thing away from the customer. So kind of from top to bottom. And then we've played around with using job to be done. But it could also be outcomes. It could be use cases that end up being one level below that. But usually it's very important to identify not only the customer, but the thing that you're trying to do for them. And then below that, you start to connect systems, tools, frameworks, services, anything like that that would help build up this solution for the person to be able to use the outcome or get to the outcome that you want. And so you do this over and over again as you go down in levels, and you keep, usually I would say, you do it as much as it makes sense. I think, not every map I've ever used has like power or electricity in it because it seems to be kind of like just a known thing at this point. But if you start getting down to like money and power, like electricity and maybe water, that's probably far enough. Like going further than that is not that helpful. And then the second thing is that I would just say about like when you're doing the value chain, you just capture as much as actually necessary. And so this is something that as time goes on, I think people get a better feeling for what is the right fidelity of these types of maps, but there's really no map. There's no bad map. There's no wrong map. There's just a lot of maps that are appropriate for this context right now in this conversation. So I would say just like whatever you think is best, that's kind of where you should stop in this case. And then you start to distribute now across the different stages. And what this is meant to do is take the value and then try to understand how these things may move from something that is brand new to something that is more kind of regular or commodified. And so this is where, say, Genesis is something that is brand new, right? It's something that was created once. It was not repeated before, something like that. Custom built ends up being usually like really high touch consultancies where they're building a prototype. But this is the thing where you start to like, when you move from Genesis to custom built, it's no longer the first of its kind, but you start to like build more and more of these, even if they're still kind of hand built in some way or rolled one at a time. But you at least have some experience doing that. So professional services might be an example of where sometimes there's like a custom built solution, but they build it many, many different times for different people. A product is something that's packaged, that's more readily available. It may still have a bit of a learning curve to use in some way, but it ends up being kind of something that can stand on its own and doesn't really require as much custom configuration or work. And then finally, commodification is that almost everybody should understand what it is, and it's very common. It's something that's widely available. Usually commodification also means that it becomes cheaper. And so there's a gameplay that starts to happen here where if something is successful in the Genesis stage, usually we'll start to move through the different phases through to commodification. And the interesting gameplay that starts to happen, this is another term that Simon uses for kind of movement of these components over time, is this Z format of kind of gameplay, which is that things will go from brand new to commodified. And then someone else will take another higher level abstraction where they create a brand new thing that then moves up to the left. And then that gets commodified. And so this kind of reverse Z pattern is something that is very common in a lot of different industries and the way that it ends up being used. So that's Wardley mapping. And just again, like, when in doubt, make your best guess here. Like there's no tried and true rule. Like there's definitely groupings and there's definitions that Simon has put together in these like very complicated tables. And I can post these to people if they want them. But you just do your best effort in doing this, because again, there's no wrong map. There's just the map that you're building for this conversation, and that's the one that you should be doing. So I would just say, like, don't overly stress about getting it perfect within these different phases. So from there, I guess what I'll do is like, let's pause for a second and just see, are there any questions about Wardley mapping that I can help answer? It seems like most people have actually done something with Wardley mapping. But yeah, I'll post the table once you start mapping. But any questions, or actually any of the experts here that do Wardley mapping, I'd love to hear. Is there anything I missed that you think is really important about Wardley mapping? And feel free to just speak up. If we start getting too many people, we can start raising hands. But until then, just if anybody has any questions.
I think one thing that Simon always emphasizes that the maps are used to generate conversations.
Totally agree. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, this is meant to be a conversation. Usually you do this in kind of a cross-functional team. Like you'd want to have lots of different perspectives that are pulling all of this together, right? It's it's almost like service, blueprinting, rich picture, all of these different things about kind of mapping and understanding of something absolutely is about the conversation. I think that's a great point. Yeah. Any other questions about this?
Another point I would make, and it's a great intro for those that don't know.
Super fast, super fast.
Yeah. But we tend, a lot of narrative in the mapping world is about justifying cloud and moving things to the right and using things on the right. There is a lot more to Wardley Map, and what's happening on the left is very important as well. So it's not just about justifying the commoditification, it's actually also to understand the new order items, whether things should stay where they are, whether they should move, and whether they are in alignment with each other. So that there's a lot more than just playing the commoditization game, and that's not what you said. It's actually in the mapping world. I think it's a bit too present as a narrative.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, is that as you start to peel the onion of understanding of these maps and use them more and more, you start to see more things about the map that you end up creating and the way that you can use this to then understand decisions. And that's what we're going to use them for today, is we're going to create a map, and then we're going to use this as a way to kind of create gameplay in a very specific way. I think this is something that a lot of expert mappers do automatically, is they start to think about the gameplay itself. This is meant to be kind of more of a way to structure that type of gameplay for people, maybe if they're not as familiar. So yeah, thank you for adding that. What else? Any questions? There's a few people that have also posted stuff in there. I think Learn Wardley Mapping, which is by Ben Moser, has like a really good set of like resources and short videos. There's of course the regular book that's on Medium. There's also a couple of videos that are out there where he does talks. He does a lot of talks at like DevOps types of places, and so like any of those talks I think are also pretty good as like an introduction. But that's again, this is not meant to be an introduction to Wardley Mapping per se. I think this is enough to give you to struggle through the exercise, but there's always more to learn. There's always more to figure out about this stuff. So yeah, any other questions or comments? All right, so what we're going to do now, hold on a second, my computer is slowing down an awful lot right now. Oh, can everybody see okay. So strategic rehearsals. The way I think about this is kind of a classic game loop. This is something that I've learned a lot through like war gamers and both casual civilian as well as military. And so usually you have some type of initial mapping, right? And so that initial mapping could be an actual map. A lot of the times when it comes to, say, military wargaming, it could be a very small map, like it's about a particular area of a particular place, but it could also be like the entire theater, which is like an entire area within the world somewhere. And actually, I'm wearing my War Games map today, which was from the movie War Games, which is a great movie. So you create with the start map, right? And we're going to use for this initial mapping is really Wardley Maps. And then we're going to take some type of event, and I'll talk about what types of events I like to play with in these types of games that would require you to actually assess how your current map fares with that event taking place. You then start to contextualize that, right? So like, what does that mean for, say, our strategy? How would we want to change what we're doing right now? What does this mean overall for what we want to now do in the future in some way? And then finally doing some type of update to your map. And so in the case of wargaming, again, it would be moving pieces around, it would be attacking. In our case, it will be thinking about the directions that we'd want to either like move things towards commodified, which is something that we want to try to do by a bunch of different techniques, like if you want to commodify something, open sourcing it is one of those gameplays that Simon Wardley talks a lot about, as well as like putting up barriers or blocks to that gameplay. And then I think in general, one of the things I don't think Wardley Mapping always covers explicitly is that there are other actions outside of this map that you could draw into this map, but maybe you didn't think about drawing it first. So for example, if like something new happens, like an event ends up taking place where you'd want to now go do some user research or some competitive analysis, or you'd want to now do something like that, you can add this to the map in some ways. And this is where I think maps become very broad. Like they're not just about, say, technical components in a system, but they could be actually like conceptual components. And so I think like I want you to consider any of these types of things, that not only like, where do we want to invest in new things? How do we add new nodes to the graph? How do we add new relationships if integrations are valuable? How do we move these nodes around? How do we split these nodes apart? Or how do we even remove nodes altogether from our solution? That's the update that we're going to be looking for inside of this map. And so this event loop starts to happen over and over again, and it can happen as many times as you want. But I find that, we only have an hour for this, so it's super accelerated. But even in the course of like an hour and a half to 2 hours, I've been able to get to, for a group of say 60 people, getting them to do initial maps, getting them to do about 3 different event cycles, and really considering it in some way. So this is meant to not, I think one of the things that I saw with a lot of other wargaming things out there is that they tend to take a lot of setup. I mean, even something like Battle Camp, right, which it comes out of Wardley Mapping. It takes an awful lot of work to get that thing set up. And so this is meant to be a much more kind of like pick up and play type of thing. And I think what's really valuable about this is related to the idea of making training and learning look more like work. And so by doing this as a group of people, so say like not only your team, right, like your cross-functional team, but even the idea of like, I work with a lot of other product managers, right? So the product group themselves doing that together to be able to see how more senior people in the organization would evolve their maps or would react to events to how more junior people in that organization would. And I think you start to then learn across different people, not only the ways that they think about the world, but the way that they may change their thinking as they react to events as well. So I think that's something that's really valuable and powerful. So when it comes to types of events, right, I think the more traditional type of event is, you'll find some signals that are in the world based on kind of what's going on, news stories, events that have already happened, and you extrapolate that out a little bit and you try to create an event that might happen to you in some way, a very specific one, right? And this is where I think when we talk about wargaming, a lot of war games are kind of, like the US military right now is thinking a lot about like what would happen during the invasion of Taiwan. And so that's a very specific event that would take place. There's a bunch of different particularities that come out of that. But I think like when you try to then extrapolate to the future, you may come up with like a particular competitive threat to your organization that you'd want to gameplay through. And so that's completely acceptable way to do this type of strategic rehearsal. Another one that I've started to play with is this idea. So this is like a list of climatic patterns within a spreadsheet, and I'll show you what the spreadsheet looks like later. But these are a bunch of different climatic patterns that Simon has identified that maybe picking one of these randomly and trying to apply it to your situation ends up causing you to think like, from a framing standpoint, what does that mean, right? And so I think this idea of randomization, because it plays up the uncertainty of the future, is something that is really powerful, I think, for this type of wargaming or for strategic rehearsals. The next thing I've used is, I love randomization. I have a whole talk about randomness and decision-making if people want to watch that. I actually randomize the sections of the talk as well as have a random question pop up every 2 to 4 minutes that's random. So it's a very random talk. But I think there's something really interesting about this type of randomness. And so Oblique Strategies are a card deck that Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt created to help unblock creatives, like mostly musicians and writers, but they end up being provocations. And so I've even used provocations like this to start to get people to think about, again, a reframing. And then I go way too far about things. And so I've even used tarot decks when it comes to kind of mysticism as a way to think about reframing, as a way to this. And this is actually something I stole from a very old school wargamer, where he didn't want people, like when we start rolling dice and we look at these tables, everything's like very official and like accurate and precise in some way. And so what he had created was, for one of his regular dice, he actually had a magic 8-ball created out of it. And so just to like push the fact that these things are all just like not real yet. They're uncertain, they're imprecise. And so using that kind of, I think, lowers the temperature on these discussions a bit and makes people maybe a little bit more open to what this could be. Now, to do tarot cards, you need to be a little bit of a charlatan and be able to read them and the symbolism inside of them. But I think it's something that we may try later today. There's lots of different types of events, is I guess what I'm saying. And these range from hyper-specific for a particular use case to these things that are incredibly random. And I think all of them are actually really interesting. And we're going to try mixing a couple of these different ones today. So when we talk about the rehearsal, right, what I would like to do now is I want to give an offer to everybody. I have an idea for what I would like to map today, but I think it will depend on people's familiarity. So what I was going to suggest was that we map ChatGPT from the standpoint of OpenAI. Now, I think that you can get highly technical with this when it comes to the components that are underneath this. So the kind of the GPT and the way that models are trained and everything. I don't think you need to necessarily go that far, but I'd love to hear if there's any other ideas. Does this seem familiar enough? It's definitely in the zeitgeist right now when it comes to technology. And so I was going to suggest that ChatGPT and OpenAI is the thing that we would map today. Any objections to that? Any other ideas for mapping? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but there is a session that Simon has conducted, which is in AI in general. So, I mean, we do not have to. I mean, it depends on what you want to go in terms of ChatGPT. Are we going to look at the LLM or the generative aspects of?
Yeah, so like what I usually think is most, like at least what most people have probably come across with ChatGPT is really the use of it as like as a customer and actually using it from the standpoint of how they apply it to the work that they do. So like, you know, I've used it. Well, I've used Bard because I work at Google, but I've used these types of technologies to like get started on a piece of writing, for example. And so I'm very familiar with that use case and maybe the components that are below that. So that's what I would say is like, I don't think this has to be super technical. If you have the technical understanding, feel free to add it to your map. But I think we can talk about it from the standpoint of like, if you've been a user of ChatGPT, think about the different components of that ChatGPT, and then as much as you can go down below that. And if it's just like, there's a model, that's really fine if that's like the fidelity that you can get to. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about that? Has everybody used ChatGPT or a technology like that, a generative AI like LLM? Okay. All right, well, if there's no objections, I think let's get started with that. And so what I'll do is let me share. Hold on a second. Let me share my, oh, I have to stop this, that's why. So I'm going to share this Miro. It should be open to everybody at this point, but if you have problems accessing it, let me know. All right. Let's see, I don't see anybody joining yet. But what you'll see here is you'll see that there's a bunch of different things here. You should be able to double click on the name area or the strategy area or the decision 1, 2, 3 area and actually write your own name. So just go somewhere in this map area, grab one of these areas and put your name next to it up at the top. You should be able to edit it. I've tried to make sure that at least that's the case. But if anybody has any problems or issues with this, let me know and I'm happy to help direct. But each person should find their own area to map. Yeah, and claim it with your name and the little name box. You can also use stickies if you want, but I put stickies kind of everywhere if you want that. Anybody have any problems doing that? And so I think what I would love for you to start doing is I want you to start basically mapping up at the top, right? There'll be the user, and that could be you. There's a use case that you're familiar with for using ChatGPT. And then I want you to start to create below that the map, the value chain, kind of up and down, and then also think about the spectrum of how either genesis or commodity these technologies or components are. And again, it can be conceptual as well if you think that's valuable. Any questions about this? And I'll give everybody about like 10 minutes of silence to do some mapping. Maybe we'll do just 5 for now, and like until 9:35 a.m. Pacific time. I'll give everybody that time. So go ahead and just start mapping. You know, if you can't connect all of it together, that's really fine. But just like get kind of like a rough map together so we can do this conversation. So I'll mute
David,
myself.
you just pick a canvas you work on.
Yeah, that's right. Pick any canvas that's there and then just that's not claimed already, and then just work on that area. And then there's sticky notes that are above or next to your board that you can use. But if you're familiar with Miro, you can just create sticky notes wherever you want. Okay. Yes, we're all creating our own individual map right now. Is just thinking a little bit about if you've now created this map where it's components of the business or kind of how things will work within the business. What would be your strategy? You know, how would you start to think about the most important trade-offs that you would consider for this type of map? And I always like to ask this question first because, yeah, there are teams that will enter into this where they'll have like a strategy document, which should be actually a manual for this type of gameplay. But a lot of the time, people don't actually consider what is their strategy at this point. Like once all this is mapped, in what ways would they think about decision making going into the future? And how would they make a decision to change things today after they've mapped things? So, yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear if anybody has any ideas about what would be a strategy they would apply. And you know, again, it doesn't have to be super broad, but I always think about, for me, strategies are like, what are the most controversial things that you need to clarify for the team? But I'd love to hear if there's any ideas that people have about the current strategy for ChatGPT based on your map. Any thoughts?
From an education standpoint, you know, you would want to be able to generate all the curriculum that's needed for school, as well as eventually, you know, becoming a product that will automatically generate the curriculum for you that is suited for your skills and suited for your personality in terms of what you want to learn.
Sure.
And drive you towards that. And with ChatGPT and with, you know, AI technology coming in, you're not able to just look at yourself, generate all the curriculum that you need. You know, for example, you're in grade 9, grade 7 or whatever. Yeah. And your target is to move to become a veterinarian, for example. And, you know, they'll give you a track in terms of how you get to that and build the curriculum for you.
Well, and so the strategy may be like, which particular domains is ChatGPT best at actually generating student content for, right? What are certain types of industries or domains that might do the best job of like where chat or the idea of like a conversational or Socratic type of learning is more ideal than, say, more rote memorization or something like that. And so I think that's how I start to think about what you're talking about when it comes to the strategy, is like, how are we making those hard decisions about where we're going to focus first or where we're going to focus right now, and then maybe how does that change over time? And so, you know, ChatGPT or GPT as a model, right, is continuing to evolve. And so what does it mean when a new model comes in? And maybe there's a lot of uncertainty, right, in how much we can actually depend that the things that we build on ChatGPT, say 3, will work on ChatGPT 4 because of the uncertainty of those types of models. And so that's another thing that we may want to consider as a risk within our strategy. So those are all things that I would start to add to what you're talking about if we're going to target something like education specifically. And then also things like partnership, right? Should OpenAI be the education partner, the main point for education, or should they partner with someone that has inroads into schools like Blackboard or one of these other kind of like educational systems to partner with instead? And so that's, again, another strategic decision that you may want to consider at this point. So that's great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Just with my understanding of American culture from television and YouTube, if I remember rightly, Texas Instruments dominated the calculator industry simply by getting training going in. And aiming at the teachers, not the students, and looking around at the maps. So unsurprisingly, let's say borrowing an idea inspired by Mike's Wardley Map, that idea of training really struck me as something that's very specific and bespoke, where you can separate yourself when it seems like a lot of the underlying technology is very similar, from the web interface to the use of text.
That's great. Yeah. So like giving it, like, not worrying as much about how we do maybe cost model, but thinking an awful lot about, well, okay, so maybe charging more, but training for free, right? Or like how we end up doing that cost model difference might be a sort of thing because we're going to focus on training. I think that's really interesting.
I would think, just so quickly get out of my head, Is that difference of if there's differences between, if there's underlying differences that either exist or you can cause between the different models.
Yep.
If you train people on your model,
Mhm.
then they and their students will stick with your model, and that's how you can differentiate yourself. When actually, with all due respect to someone at Google and so on, like Bard looks like ChatGPT looks like everything else, because they're all using the same text to talk to us and for us to talk to them.
Totally. No, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, David, what you wanted to add something?
Sorry about that. I lost my window. So I was looking at the map and I've been following the space pretty closely. And in terms of a Wardley map, I see a lot of stuff that's being commoditized really, really quickly.
Yeah.
Almost insanely fast compared to like cloud or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I think there's, from a OpenAI strategy perspective, there's good and bad to that, right? The things they probably thought were going to be part of their strategy are eroding really quickly. Like they're basically almost getting into the mode of playing catch up with open source in terms of the models. So what's kind of left for them is early mover status in a fast moving market in like APIs. Like if you want to do object storage on the internet, you use S3. It doesn't matter which provider because they all provide S3 APIs for it. So they can become the lingua franca for talking through an API to an LLM. And that potentially gives them an angle of being first mover, most likely choice, and things like that. And as far as the stuff that's in the custom, that like the APIs, the integrations, even the model, those are shifting to commodity really fast. But trust, which is mainly like a brand type thing, is not necessarily, right? Everyone's still kind of like giving the whole LLM thing, like they're excited about it, but they're very hesitant too. What's the legality of it? What's, all sorts of angles that there are to have questions about. So if OpenAI, I would think almost like becoming the most trusted name in AI could be their biggest strategic advantage in the future.
Focusing
right?
everything on how we gain trust. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So
Philippe, what else did you want to add? And then we can do a gameplay step after you say something.
In doing the map, something that is coming out for me is it's interesting how ChatGPT is kind of pushing Google out of business, the Google search engine. But on the other hand, I do believe that it probably relies on Google a lot to go and browse and learn. So for all learning algorithms, it probably goes into Google to get the sources. So it's an interesting thing that there's kind of a circular relationship here where ChatGPT replaces Google, but needs Google.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's a really interesting paper that just came out about like how much more high quality data is out there for these models to use. And this one person had estimated that we'll run out of high quality text data by 2027. So there's some interesting dynamics that start to happen there. So yeah, thank you. That's really great. So now,
another thing I thought about as well is I'm okay with Google referencing me because it will bring back traffic to my place and promote me. I'm not so okay with ChatGPT taking what I think and regurgitating it to somebody else because it's appropriation of IP. And in a way, it doesn't. In a way, how do you no index ChatGPT? And how dull will ChatGPT become if there's no index ChatGPT?
Yeah.
So that would be an interesting one as well. And I don't think that's a space that has really been addressed so far.
Yeah, I mean, there's some startups that are out there that are thinking about how do you turn yourself and your domain of knowledge into the equivalent of a ChatGPT. But I think you bring up a really good point. So that's interesting. So now
IP appropriation would be massive in this space.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So now that we've talked about the strategy, like this is usually something I like to do with these to make sure that everybody kind of thinks about like what are the trade-offs that they would need to make in some way. And so now we'll take a turn, right? So we're going to review an event that is going to take place. We're going to consider how this impacts your map and what actions you might take outside of the map or add to the map. You would update the map, so you could add new components, usually up and to the left of other components, but it could be below it. You could move components, usually to the right, but again, like it takes specific work to do that. And then I want you to kind of note what changed in the map. And so I usually like to create this little bit of like audit trail on the right-hand side where it says decision 1, decision 2, decision 3. Just want you to write a quick summary of kind of like what you thought would happen and what that meant. And so the first event, because we're doing something like ChatGPT, a major competitor starts to take customer share away from you. Now, this is pretty generic, right? Like, but I could have written it in a very specific way, which is that, Google Bard starts to take, share away from ChatGPT. And so my question would be, what would you now do to react to that in some way? And so I want you to just take a minute to think about that based on your map. And if your context is learning, then I would ask, like, what does that mean to now have another player inside the space? How would that change partnership? If we're talking about this kind of circular dependencies that you were just mentioning, like, what does that mean with regards to this? And so I want you to take that as an event. Now, this is like, again, this would have been a stand-in for the type of event that was like the specific curated event that is based on trends potentially, but you could have gone the other way too, that you keep gaining market share, right? So I'll let everybody think for a second about that.
Are we using that as an event?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm saying this is the first event. And if you want to just like write down a quick little note in the decision 1 part of that, it's more just like for you to be able to keep track as you think about these things, but that's the first event. Let's say that you just start losing market share to your major competitor. So does anybody have any ideas about what this would change about your map?
I would say embrace it, embrace the change, embrace the competition that, for example, Bard and OpenAI could come in. A new set of management kind of meta AI that will collaborate with other AI to pull in other information and compare the different models together. Before I know it's a bit futuristic, it's a bit out of the
That's okay. No, this is great. Again, like we're here to talk about like variants of ideas as well. So yeah, that's interesting. Anything else?
Yeah.
I could see moving from like the B2C to the B2B, sort of like TiVo and BlackBerry and all these others that, started out with sort of shiny consumer brands. I mean, how many people actually know that TiVo is still around, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, like what does that mean? And even things like Google Glass, which was just recently canceled, was mostly an enterprise play for the last couple of years, right? Like to your point. So there's definitely a pattern there.
Yeah, be part of the ecosystem and maintain a hold there, because you support others in gaining the users, and it's really about your ability to partner rather than to stomp Google, right? Why not be the alternative to Google for others that are trying to do more specific things in different verticals and such?
That's great. Well, and so, how would you apply your strategy is usually the next question I would ask, because we had just talked about maybe what are the trade-offs that we're usually going to make. Does the strategy is it still valid now? Or, I've done a couple of these workshops with people where they start to then find that their strategies are incredibly reactive and they're not as committed to their strategy as they think they are. And so I think that's the next question I would ask. And then another question that I like to ask, and I realize, again, we're kind of short on time. I think I mistimed the fact that I had to give like a Wardley Mapping introduction in this, whereas the last time I didn't do it as much. But like, what would your Bizarro strategy be? And when I say Bizarro, I mean the opposite of what your strategy currently is, but is valid for another company. So for example, this comes from Richard Rummelt's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. Talks a lot about how like being the best at something is really just fluff. And that's because like you would probably not say you would be at the worst of something as part of your strategy usually. Now, you could be, for example, if we take airlines, right? There could be airlines that want to be the best and most luxurious, but most expensive. And then the trade-off you make is that you're not going to be luxurious and you're cheap. And that could be completely valid as opposite strategies, right? That's the difference between like Southwest and Singapore Air, for example. Singapore Air is about really long haul type of flights that are highly luxurious, high quality. Southwest is about a lot of short corridors that get a lot of traffic, right? And so I think what I always like to ask is like, what is this bizarro strategy that you would also consider? And is that a better strategy or a worse strategy than the one you're currently taking for your organization in some way? And then I always ask, like, what do you think will happen next, right? So from this perspective, you know, there's probably things that you think are going to happen from an industry trend standpoint. It's always just interesting to see, you know, even in these types of games that are basically random, right? How are people thinking about this in some way as far as like moving to the future? And then the gameplay, you know, we talk about how we, you know, a couple months later, we are now going to deal with another event. Okay. And so just for the purpose of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this climactic patterns spreadsheet that I have, and I'm going to pull a random number between 2 and 29, which is the list of these climactic patterns. And so I don't know why it's, there we go, 15. 15, capital flows. Let me increase this for everybody. Capital flows to new areas of value. So let me post actually this. I'll post this into the chat so everybody can have it, but I want you to now take a moment and I want you to think about what does this mean with regards to if this pattern started to happen. One, how would you contextualize it? What would that mean to you? And then two, how would that change the way that you're actually thinking about your strategy and the map that you have? What changes would you want to make? So I'll let everybody read this for a second and think about it. So how does this change the way people think about things?
I think your illustration of the different airline between the long haul airline and the low cost carrier is a great example here. And being from the airline industry myself, I actually know the space very well.
Yeah, cool.
It becomes hyper categorized, you know, in terms of how things are saying. You're saying that, you know, Singapore Air, yes, Singapore Air becomes what they call traditional airlines. So does every other country will have one. And then every other country newcomer will start a new low-cost carrier. One thing is because it's cheaper. Second thing is because the market is already there. And what causes the big airlines to do is then start cutting down the areas of value, you know, where, you know, they might not need, for example, a paid a meal all the time in the plane. Therefore, they start cutting down all this fat that they do not need. They started flying, started doing more fuel optimization. So they're looking at how the optimized fuel, like what the low-cost carrier does. You know, they buy fuel ahead of time, and they buy in bulk in some way and trade them on the market before, you know, flying the thing, and ensuring that every passenger is of a certain allowance of baggage. Therefore, they start cutting down, you know, in terms of looking at when capital becomes tight, or shifting capital away. I would think that, you know, one thing that most managers will look at is how to then optimize their department better, and look at how to cut down the fats that they need.
Well, and so maybe some of the things that we would consider in this case is like, how do we get hyper focused on like efficiency or efficacy of running these very large models on the most expensive thing, which is Azure compute, right? And so there's maybe something about that. Yeah, that's interesting. What else? does this make people think of? And again, asking some of the same questions, like how does your strategy apply in this case? What would your Bizarro strategy do in this case? And how is that either different or similar? And what do you think will happen next? Any other ideas based on this climactic pattern?
Another thing is to become nationalized or pseudo-nationalized as a government resource.
Interesting.
So just thinking about, you have government highway state system, etc. One way you could think about is large language models and whatever are public good that should be nationalized. And there's some parts of the world where that may be the case, or at least quasi-nationalized entities.
Yeah,
China comes to mind.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and how that might work. Like, some of the things that OpenAI has said in front of like Congress feels a little bit like regulatory capture, right? Like, I want you to regulate us in this way that could effectively do what you're talking about, which would make it a very small number of players potentially. But taking it another step is like, what does nationalization mean? I think is really interesting. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, for me, I'm more in the service business, and it kind of shocks me every time I try and use ChatGPT and maybe I'm not using it right, but most of the time I end up completely rewriting whatever it spits out.
Totally.
And I kind of take the perspective that actually I'm not in the business of being in the average. I'm in the business of being above the average. And ChatGPT by definition is going to harvest average data and give you some average things.
That's right.
So for me, it's a useful benchmark, but actually looking at if that was to happen, your event 1 and 2, it's actually recentering organic intelligence. And at some point, I'm wondering if it's worth trying to get funding for people to regroup on organic intelligence rather than AI.
And I would say, like, if you're going to refocus on organic, it ends up being, how do you find these use cases that are best to aid or assist organic intelligence, right? Like, to your point, whenever I generate one of these, like a post from one of these services, I end up reading it and then writing something completely different, basically, because I know what I should not write now, because that's like the average of the internet or something like that. So yeah, that's interesting. And so I know we're short on time. So then now we would assume that like a couple months have gone by, right? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw 2 tarot cards, and I'm going to read them for everybody. And then we're going to pretend like, what do these tarot cards mean? So I'm giving you now a tarot card reading for your business right now as OpenAI. I'm the official tarot card reader. And the 2 cards that we just got was the 6 of Pentacles, not inverted, and the 8 of Swords inverted. Okay. And so in this case, the 6 of Pentacles is about some type of judgment, because you can see the scale right there. You can also see that there's some type of hard judgment from the standpoint of giving money to one person and not the other. And so I think there's this kind of tone of harder prioritization, right? Having to make a hard choice about how you fund things. And yeah, so I think that's how I'd read that card. There is something that's interesting though, because there's like a little red card in the blue guy's clothing right here. And so I think it's that there's something secret or hidden behind the choice that you don't make. And then the inverse of the swords, so if you read this one this way, it ends up being that there's a person that is like tied up and basically held in this like fence or border between 2 places, right? And that they're blindfolded and they're kind of left outside. You can see that the castle is on the inside. So they're outside whatever we're talking about right now. But because it was inverted, what that means is that we're actually going to say that it's the opposite of that. So they're actually part of this. So what are the things that that are inside kind of like our domain that maybe we're blind to right now in some way? And so now what I want you to do is, based on the reading of these 2 cards, how does your strategy apply? And how does that change things? And maybe, you know, what is that your Bizarro strategy in this case? And then what do you think will happen next? So how are people interpreting these events if we're talking about, you know, again, some type of hard prioritization and then something happening inside of our own organization that we're blind to? Is this a bridge too far? Is the other question.
It's too abstract.
Too abstract? Okay. Yeah, the thing that's interesting about randomness cards is that they create a certain amount of confusion, but sometimes they can create too much confusion for certain audiences. So I fully realize that. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to, with all due respect to Michael, who I've met as part of the mapping community before, and I do mean that also, but I completely disagree with you. I think well, no, I don't. It depends on who's using the cards and the spirit in which they're used. As in a very quick look online, the 6 of coins is about giving money to the poor. So from like, the choice of website choice, and also from having looked into it a little, it depends which tarot cards you're using and which interpretations and so on and so on. But the thing about all of that is that's not important. It's that you use something that gives you an idea. So for this, giving to the poor, okay, so who can we give free access to for this?
Fair enough.
And what do we gain out of it? For the 8 of Pentacles, 8 of Swords,
Eight of Swords.
inverted, which again, the first Google's search engine decided which answer I took was to focus on self-limiting beliefs and what restrictions are you put in place.
Cool.
Which again, with the right team and in the right spirit, you're like, okay, what assumptions are we bringing in that means we're missing ideas? To look down a side path, what red team thinking do we need to bring in?
Interesting.
That means there's something we can do with their product that we just can't think of because we've all been working on it. Who else do we need to bring in to look at this map? In the same way, looking around the Miro, there's great ideas that I've been borrowing from other people's. So that's how I would take those
That's great.
cards. And I like tarot because it has a lot of it's got such weight to it, regardless of what you think of it. It means so much to so many people, and we all immediately knew what it was, presumably across different cultures.
Yeah.
And I think you can use that really effectively. So it's really good to see someone in your position go, hey, look at this, let's get some random ideas here. And and sorry, I'm going on, but that's really got me thinking, which is the
no, that's cool. And I appreciate you actually, again, like I was just reading this based on my like associative type of creativity, but I think you bring up a good point that like there's lots of different ways to read these cards. Like I could have also used the I Ching, right, which is another thing that ends up creating one of 64 different kind of provocations or fortunes that could be used in a very similar way. What I think is interesting about the tarot cards is they did a analysis of the topics, usually of the interpretations of the tarot cards. And I think it's related to the amount of confusion that you want to have in these types of randomization, in that tarot cards were usually used to talk about your future, which people cared about: love, money, relationships, family, health. And so the themes of these cards, as they're most interpreted, tend to cluster around those types of things, right? So I think using ChatGPT or GPT as another example of this is like, what is enough confusion to add to the space that allows you to now reframe? And I think there's something very interesting about large language models that maybe get you to that point, is like, what is the industry version of tarot for you, right? And so anyways, crazy idea, but like just something to think about. And I appreciate your interpretation of this too. I think that's great. Thank you. Cool. Yeah, Philippe.
I like the idea of the tarot because it's kind of a bit of a chaos monkey testing.
Totally. I steal an
testing
awful lot from the
things
chaos
and-
engineering domain, like especially, yeah. So I think there's some amazing things that come out of that.
But it's also give you the interpretation that you want to take out of it. So it's not
right.
too rigid, which is great. And for me, it brings a point around what resonates to the tarot card is who is giving. So if I take that the client, actually all the clients really wanting something different, or they're completely fine with the average.
Yeah.
And where do I find the ones that want something better than the average?
Yeah.
And there may be lesser, and then maybe they may give lesser. So it brings all those questions and actually note it down. For instance, should we go into education? Because if we bring up people with the average, are we going to have something great to look forward in our future? Are we building the future for our kids and so on? I'm not sure. So maybe that, to me, that triggers that thing.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some things I need to look at beyond the world we are in with businesses and so on, into education and other parts.
Well, what you're talking about too is like, we create all these documents within organizations around values or principles, but like how often do we actually point to them in a lot of ways? Like Amazon, I think, does a pretty good job with the way they talk about like their I think their values is what they call them, but they're used an awful lot. I'm sorry.
The leadership principles.
Leadership principles. Thank you. And so like my question, I think one of the things you can do is taking your documents, your canonical documents around values and principles and strategy, and then using that inside of these things to say, like, are they actually real or not? And I think this gets to some concepts around strategy that I'm kind of trying to write. I'm struggling through writing a piece about this idea of like, how often are strategies just collections of the way that we've actually made decisions so far versus the idea of being aspirational ways that we want to make decisions. And so I think like what I've found just like personally is it's usually like a muddling of those two things. Basically, half of them are like kind of the way we've done it, but then the other half end up being like how we want to be making decisions in the future. And it seems like the aspirational ones are less likely to actually come true. So I think there's something interesting there about that too, is like using these games as a way to actually validate values, principles, strategies, like any of these documents that we end up creating with like executive teams, like, is this real or not, right? Or will this be used in a way? And so one of the teams I did this with, like, they were like, oh, wow, we are incredibly reactive. We didn't follow any of our strategic principles when we were actually using this. And so that could just be, we need to get more accustomed and familiar with them, but it also mean that they're not actually valuable strategies in some way. So anyways, that's the last thing I wanted to add there. And so usually like at the end of this type of workshop, and I realize we're over, so I'll try to wrap this up, but like there's a bit of reflection that we end up doing. And it's like, did we follow our strategies, or did we actually make decisions that were akin to our values, right? What does this mean about like the way we want to now change our current strategies or how we're thinking about things? And so, I think with that, I would love to just pause on kind of one, was there anything you learned today that you thought was very interesting? And then there's going to be an email that will go out where I'd love to get your feedback on this workshop and the concepts inside of this workshop. You don't have to copy. I try to get a shortened link. It doesn't feel like a shortened link now that I look at it right here. But it will be sent out to everybody that RSVP'd. I would love to get just like 5 minutes of your time to give me some feedback. And then I'll also link to the decision rehearsal post on the uncertainty project. But I'd love to hear, like, was there anything people learned here that they'd like to share with people before we finish?
I think for me, I learned about how to, spot test strategy quickly in terms of how things are being done, and how I could imagine in a team you get a whole lot more ideas in terms of how you're going to move certain things, and it becomes a facilitation not nightmare, but I think it's a joy to have all this information up there.
Yeah.
And the randomness is really, really interesting. I think it really drives the discussion in our brain, and it does give me a workout in the brain as well.
Well, so what I'll do is I'll make sure that when the email goes out, I'll post a link to my talk about randomness in case people are interested in that too, just because I think it's related to some of these topics, but it was a precursor to this particular type of work.
I just have one question.
Yeah.
Why the team rehearsal?
Why the what?
The team rehearsal.
Oh, inside of a lot of organizations, they're trying to clean up language that is military focused. And so rehearsal seems more neutral in some way, because I think like it's meant to point to that rather than wargaming. And so that's the reason why. Yeah.
Because it comes to mind when you say military, it becomes the dress rehearsal. Thing came to me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. I just chose rehearsal because I felt like it kind of got at the fact that we're trying things out. I think it doesn't necessarily relay the uncertainty of even if the result comes out a certain way in the rehearsal, that it's not the way the future will happen. So that's maybe something I still need to consider. But it was trying to reduce kind of military terminology is what it was.
Okay, yeah, cool.
I found it really interesting to have the idea of wargaming in terms of bringing that into other domains. So I was leading a project a couple of years ago, and we had a public contributor who had, I think, experience of working in defense, and he's saying, well, you need to be wargaming this. And we were like, we don't know what that is. So let's just ignore that comment. But now I kind of get it. Like, 2 years on, I apologize to him that we didn't really get what he was on about. But now I kind of understand how that could be applied to like non-military context, those principles. And so I found that really helpful. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I think that is important, is that when we talk about wargaming, really what we're saying is that we're going to do some type of kind of branching into the future based on decisions. And that's really all it means, right? Like, and I would argue that actually really great like roadmaps end up being more like branching kind of maps. They're more about like, here's what we think will happen, and there's some branch that could happen. And this is why like the concept of like tripwires inside of organizations, like what is a tripwire that if this happens, we should reconsider this part of our strategy. And that's based on the idea of that there's assumptions that are underpinning everything we do, that if those assumptions change, we should now change what we end up doing. And I relate this to like Kairos and Chronos time. So Chronos time is like the pattern of weekly, quarterly, yearly type of planning that just happens, right? And gives space for execution. But then there's like Kairos time, which is narrative or event-based things, where like when I was working I worked at Facebook Reality Labs on the Portal device, which is like a calling device, a video calling device. When COVID happened, we realized that there were a bunch of things that needed to change. So one, we thought that our device would be used a lot more in certain ways, but also that other things we were working on that were maybe more about like, how is this a portal to the real world rather than a virtual one of talking to people? Those became less important in some ways. And so I think there's something really interesting, again, about the underpinnings of why you have a strategy. And if those assumptions end up getting violated or changing, that is when you should go back and revisit this. And so I think there's something related about that as well. But that's like that branching into the future, I think is a more interesting roadmap than here's how we're going to do this exactly for the next 6 months type of thing.
Yeah, and I think in my industry, there's quite a lot of imagining our desired future and fixating on that, and not really thinking about what would happen if something went a little bit wrong with that. And this is quite a nice way into thinking about, well, what if that doesn't quite work out how we want our beautiful future world to be?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I've also paired this with teams with like scenario planning, where we take 2 uncertainties and create a 2x2 of like 4 different worlds that could be in the future. And inside of that, we can then say, how does our strategy fare in any of these worlds? How prepared are we for these worlds? And then what are things like, how likely are these worlds? And then finally, what could we do more of to help prepare us for these worlds? And so scenario planning, I think, is another one of those exercises that, again, you can do as a group that is really valuable to hear how different people on your team end up doing this. It's not a solo activity, right? Like, again, just like Wardley Mapping, it can be a solo activity. You can do it on your own, definitely. But I think it's more valuable because you're gaining alignment or understanding of each other inside of these activities as well. So, yeah. I do have to run right now. I'm sorry, I have a hard stop at 10:15 my time. But thank you so much, everybody, for attending this. And then I'll make sure that the notes there's an email that was sent out in like about an hour or 2 automatically, but I'll make sure that the link to the article and then the randomness talk is there. And thank you again. And I'd love to get your feedback also. So that feedback link will be in there. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting it together.
Absolutely. Bye.